He pulled her over, ignored her credentials, and tried to intimidate her. What he didn't know was that she was one of the most powerful judges in the state, and this time the cameras were rolling. She saw the lights before she heard the siren. It was just after 10:30 p.m. on a quiet stretch of Y-23, about 2 miles from her home in Macon, Georgia. Judge Marlene DuPont had left the city's annual legal aid gala 30 minutes earlier. She'd been honored that night for her 35 years of service, 25 of those as a superior court judge. The event was a polished affair, full of tuxedos and polite laughter, champagne toasts and handshakes. Marlene had worn a navy blue silk gown with a silver brooch passed down from her grandmother. Her heels now rested on the floorboard, swapped for sensible flats. She was tired, but content. So when the lights from the rearview mirror flared red and blue, her heart didn't jump, just fluttered a little, the way anyone's might. She signaled, pulled to the shoulder, and turned on her dome light. Then she reached for her license and registration. Her judicial ID sat openly on the seat beside her. As always, she kept her hands on the wheel and waited. Seconds later, a sharp tap on the window broke the quiet. She turned and saw him. Mid-40s, pale skin, close-cut blonde hair, tall, rigid. His belt seemed to carry more gear than necessary. He didn't lean in or speak softly. His flashlight beam went straight to her face. "Step out of the vehicle," he barked. No greeting, no reason, not even a request for her documents. Marlene blinked. "Officer, may I ask why I'm being—" "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am. Now!" There was no mistaking the aggression. She exhaled slowly. "Sir, I'm Judge Marlene DuPont of the Bibb County Superior Court. I'm not resisting, I just—" "Did I ask who you were?" he snapped. "I gave a lawful order. Step out!" He didn't flinch. Marlene hesitated, then carefully unbuckled her seatbelt. She reached for the door handle with slow, deliberate motion. Her left hand stayed visible. Outside, the night air hit her bare shoulders. She stood tall, 5'6" without heels, keeping her chin high, but her expression calm. "Put your hands where I can see them." She did. "Is there a problem, Officer?" "Radford. Officer Clint Radford." "Okay. Officer Radford, I wasn't speeding, I wasn't swerving. If this is about something else, I'm happy to cooperate. But I would like to know, you fit the description of a suspect in the area." That was all he said. Marlene frowned. "What kind of suspect?" "I'm wearing a gown and coming from a courthouse event. I have my credentials inside the car." "I said keep your hands up." He walked around her car, looking through the windows, his flashlight darting over her seats. Then he radioed something in. She couldn't hear what. Cars passed slowly on the highway, some turning their heads. A few honked. She felt a knot form in her stomach. She'd handled murder trials, put gang leaders behind bars, diffused courtroom brawls with a single look. But this man, he wasn't interested in reason. "Back up en route," he muttered. "For what?" she asked, still calm, but louder now. "You haven't told me why I was pulled over. You haven't even asked for my ID." He didn't respond, just stood 5 feet away, hand resting on his holster. She could feel it now, fear mixing with frustration, but her voice never wavered. "My ID is on the seat. Judicial credentials. You can verify my identity." Radford took a step closer, squinting. "I don't care who you say you are. I've had enough people lie to me in this job. You can be anybody in a dress." Marlene's jaw tensed. "Officer, you are now being recorded. That house back there, those are my neighbors. They're watching." Radford turned, catching sight of 2 people on a porch across the road, phones raised. He muttered something under his breath, but instead of de-escalating, he reached for his radio again. "Requesting additional backup. Non-compliant female, possibly armed." Her heart dropped, but she knew if she panicked, he'd win, so she stood still, letting the silence do the talking. For now. 2 more patrol cars pulled up within 3 minutes. Lights flashing, engines idling, radios crackling. Marlene didn't move. She stood there on the gravel shoulder, arms still slightly raised, her feet aching now in her flats. The thin fabric of her gown fluttered lightly in the wind. It looked almost absurd. This elegant woman in an evening dress, surrounded by armed officers on the side of a highway. One of the new arrivals, a younger cop with a round face and nervous energy, approached first. He glanced at Radford, then at Marlene. "What's going on here?" he asked, keeping his voice low. "She refused to comply," Radford answered sharply. "Claims she's a judge. I don't buy it." "She said she's who?" "Some judge from Bibb County. Says she was at some gala." The young cop turned back to Marlene. "Ma'am, do you have ID?" "It's on the seat of my car. My judicial ID is visible through the window." The third officer, a tall woman with dark brown hair pulled back tight, had been quiet until now. She stepped closer and peered through the passenger window. "Yep, that's a Superior Court ID," she confirmed. "Name matches the car registration." Radford didn't seem fazed. "Anyone can print a fake badge. Doesn't prove anything." The female officer raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Marlene took a slow breath. "Officer Radford, I've complied with every instruction. I haven't made any sudden moves. I've informed you of my identity. At this point, your behavior is aggressive and without clear cause." Radford's eyes narrowed. "You don't get to decide how I do my job." The tension was thick. From across the street, more neighbors had come outside. 3 people stood behind a short metal fence, phones still up, recording every second. A man with a grey hoodie called out, "She's a judge, man! What are y'all doing?" Radford turned toward the voice. "Stay back!" But the shouting didn't stop. Another woman, about Marlene's age, yelled, "That's Judge DuPont! Everyone around here knows her!" Still, Radford held his ground. His right hand hovered too close to his holster again. Marlene's voice remained even. "I'm not a threat. I'm not armed. There's no lawful reason for this level of force." The young cop seemed torn. He walked a few feet away and started murmuring into his radio. Meanwhile, Radford stepped closer again. "You think you're better than everyone else just because you sit in some fancy chair in a courtroom?" Marlene looked him straight in the eye. "No, but I do know the law. And this isn't how it's supposed to work." Radford smirked. "You people always think you're special." The words landed like a slap. Not just because of what he said, but how easily it came out. Marlene didn't flinch, but she saw the female officer look away, jaw clenched. Radford continued, "You think flashing a badge means you can ignore commands? Not tonight." She replied, calm but clear. "I never ignored your command. I asked a question. That's not the same thing." Another officer's radio cracked loudly. The young one returned to the group. "Supervisor's on the way. Should be here any minute." Radford shook his head. "Don't need a supervisor to deal with this." "Yes, you do," the female officer interrupted finally. Her voice was steady, but there was something under it. An edge. "We've got a judicial ID, registered vehicle, no sign of threat, and you called backup twice. Protocol says we wait for a supervisor when identity is disputed, especially with someone who holds office." Radford stared at her. For a second, no one said anything. Marlene stood perfectly still, not from fear anymore, from purpose. And as the next headlights came over the hill, it was clear someone else had arrived to see what Officer Clint Radford was trying so hard to hide. But the real damage had already begun, because once a word leaves your mouth, you can't take it back. The supervisor's SUV pulled up fast but silent, headlights sweeping the scene before easing to a stop behind the other units. Out stepped Captain Richard Mays, a stocky man in his early 50s with dark suspenders barely hidden beneath his uniform shirt. He wasn't flashy or loud, but every cop on that road shifted a little straighter when he arrived. He walked toward the group, glancing quickly between the officers, then to Marlene. "Evening," he said, tone flat. "Somebody want to tell me why we've got 3 units on a traffic stop with a Superior Court judge in an evening gown?" Radford spoke up first. "She was uncooperative, matched a description from earlier, didn't follow my commands." Mays turned to Marlene. Ma'am, I'm Captain Mays. You okay? I'm cold, tired, and angry, Marlene said without raising her voice. I was pulled over for no clear reason, not asked for ID, ordered out of my car, and surrounded. My credentials have been visible from the start. Mays looked over at the female officer. She's got her badge and registration on the passenger seat. Everything checks out. No traffic violation noted. The officer replied. Mays turned back to Radford. What's the real issue here, Clint? Radford didn't answer right away. His face was tight, jaw set. She didn't comply when I told her to step out, he muttered. You didn't ask for her license first? No. May's eyes narrowed. And what description are you referring to? Radford shifted on his feet. Black female in a dark vehicle. That's what dispatch said. Mays sighed and rubbed his temple. That's your probable cause? That? On Highway 23 at 10:30 p.m.? You know how many people that could apply to? Radford said nothing. By now, half a dozen neighbors stood near their fences. A few were quietly narrating into their phones. One of them, a teenager with a steady hand, had been live streaming the entire incident. Mays looked back at Marlene. Judge DuPont, I sincerely apologize. I'll personally escort you home if you'd like. She shook her head. That's not necessary. I live less than 2 miles away, but this situation isn't over just because you arrived. I understand, Mays said. But then, as if determined to torch the last bridge standing, Radford blurted, She's probably pulling this just to make herself look like a victim. These people love to cry wolf. A dead silence fell. Mays turned. What did you just say? Radford stood his ground. I've seen this playbook before. Pretend to be a victim, get everyone all riled up, and paint the cop as the bad guy. Clint, stop, the female officer warned. But it was too late. Marlene turned to Captain Mays. You heard him. He's not just biased, he's dangerous. Mays nodded, eyes fixed on Radford. Turn off your radio. Hand over your badge and weapon. You're on administrative leave effective immediately. Internal Affairs will contact you in the morning. Radford laughed, short and bitter. Unbelievable. Over this? Over this. Mays repeated. You're done for tonight. Go home. Radford looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He stormed off toward his cruiser, muttering under his breath. The crowd across the street clapped once, then louder. A neighbor shouted, About time! Marlene didn't move. Her hands were now at her sides, the air cooler than before. The female officer stepped closer, gently. Judge, I'm truly sorry. You handled that with more patience than I would have. Marlene gave a half nod. Patience is easy when you've spent 3 decades waiting for the system to catch up to its promises. Her voice was low, but it hit hard. Captain Mays exhaled. Ma'am, if you'd like to file a formal complaint... Oh, I will, Marlene said, her eyes never leaving Radford's car as it pulled away. But not just a complaint. I want policy reviewed. I want this on record. And I want every young officer on your force to watch this video and ask themselves who they would have been tonight. Mays met her gaze. Understood, but the real storm wasn't outside anymore. It was coming for everything that had been allowed to fester too long behind closed doors. By the next morning, the video had already hit 200,000 views. By the afternoon, it was on every local news channel and crawling up national feeds. But inside Judge Marlene DuPont's home, it was quiet. She sat at her kitchen table, robe tied loosely, a fresh cup of coffee in her hand, and her phone on silent. Her daughter, Simone, a civil rights attorney in Birmingham, had driven in before sunrise. She stood at the counter, flipping through texts from reporters. You've got CNN calling, Simone said softly. Do you want to? No, Marlene didn't look up. They want to talk about the incident. That's what they're calling it. It wasn't an incident, it was a pattern. Simone sat down across from her. You sure you don't want me to handle the press? This thing's growing fast. Everybody's got an opinion. Some folks already calling you a hero. Others. Marlene gave a faint smile. I didn't do anything heroic. I stood still and refused to be erased. That shouldn't make headlines. Simone nodded, but her fingers tapped the table. The police union put out a statement. They're backing Radford, saying it was a misunderstanding exacerbated by high-pressure protocol. Marlene set her cup down. Of course they are. But here's the part they didn't count on, Simone added. One of the other officers filed a report. Officer Medina, the woman on scene. She included everything Radford said, word for word. Marlene looked up at that. Good, she said. That matters. Later that day, Marlene received a visit from a city official. Deputy Mayor Alan Stokes, someone she'd known for 20 years. He was polite, cautious. He brought flowers. Marlene, he said as she opened the door. I'm so sorry about what happened. She stepped aside, letting him in without a word. They sat on her couch, where the air still carried the scent of lavender and coffee. We want to make this right, Stokes began. The mayor is drafting a statement. We'd like to issue a formal apology from the city and the department. Privately, if that's preferred. Marlene stared at him. Privately? Well, yes. To preserve your privacy, your dignity. My dignity doesn't need preserving, she said firmly. It wasn't damaged? His was. Stokes cleared his throat. Of course. But we also don't want to escalate tensions unnecessarily. Tensions were escalated the moment I was treated like a criminal with no cause. That moment is already public. You don't get to hide the apology behind a curtain. Stokes looked uneasy. I'm not asking for a banner, she continued. But I'm not going to be a footnote either. What happened needs to be addressed out loud. He nodded slowly. I'll speak to the mayor. Before he left, she said one more thing. And make sure Officer Medina is protected. Retaliation is real. The next day, Internal Affairs launched an investigation. A town hall was announced. It filled up within hours. Hundreds of community members lined up outside a local high school auditorium, waiting to hear from city leaders, and from Marlene herself. Inside, under the low hum of fluorescent lights, Marlene stood behind a wooden podium in her Sunday best. This time, she chose her robe. Not the silk one, but the one from the courtroom. She didn't speak with fire. She didn't raise her voice. But every word landed like a stone in still water. I wasn't afraid because of a gun. I was afraid because I saw something I've seen my whole life. Someone deciding that my presence, my tone, my very existence made them uncomfortable, and they used that discomfort as justification for power. No one made a sound. We keep waiting for people like Clint Radford to reveal themselves, but they're not hiding. They're being protected, defended, excused. That protection has to end. She stepped away from the podium. The room stood with her. But applause doesn't fix systems. And Marlene knew this moment had to lead somewhere, or it would vanish like all the others before it. 2 weeks later, the internal investigation reached a turning point. Officer Clint Radford was officially suspended without pay, pending termination. The department released a carefully worded statement about officer accountability and protocol review, but it read like a sheet of excuses stapled together. Still, the pressure didn't let up. Marlene didn't seek interviews, but the media came anyway. News vans lined the road outside her home for days. She refused most requests, but agreed to one sit-down, on her own terms, with a local station that had always treated her court coverage with respect. The interview was filmed in her living room. No fancy lighting, no script. Just Marlene, seated in an armchair with her hands folded neatly. The reporter asked her what she wanted people to take away from all this. I don't need people to be outraged, Marlene said. That burns hot and fades fast. I need them to remember. The law isn't always just, and the people tasked with enforcing it aren't always fair. What happened to me could have ended very differently if I wasn't a judge, or if that neighbor didn't hit record. The clip went viral. Again. At the same time, the department's union held a press conference. They painted Radford as a veteran officer, under pressure in a climate of public hostility toward law enforcement. They blamed social media. They blamed the optics. They never once blamed him. But the community wasn't having it. Demonstrations sprang up in front of City Hall, most of them peaceful, some emotional. They didn't just chant Marlene's name, they demanded body cam reform, mental health evaluations for incoming officers, and ongoing bias training that wasn't just a box to check. Then came the twist no one saw coming. An anonymous leak from inside the department revealed that Officer Radford had 3 previous complaints against him for excessive force, none of which had reached the public. 2 were settled quietly. 1 was dismissed internally. All of them involved black drivers. The city scrambled. The mayor called a press conference to address transparency concerns. But by then, the damage wasn't just reputational. It was institutional. Meanwhile, Radford made a move of his own. He went on a podcast hosted by a right-wing former sheriff. The episode was titled, "Targeted: The True Story of an Innocent Cop, Smeared by Woke Culture." In it, he claimed Marlene had been hostile from the start and accused her of pulling the race card to make herself look like a victim. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, voice tight with resentment. "She wanted to make an example out of me, and I lost everything." The public's reaction split hard. Some called him a scapegoat. Others said he finally exposed himself. Marlene didn't respond to the podcast. She didn't need to. The community was speaking for her now. Signs appeared on church lawns and community boards. "Stand with Judge DuPont." A local artist painted her portrait on the side of a library building, next to the words, "Grace is power restrained." One Sunday morning, as she walked into her regular church service, a small boy tugged at her coat sleeve and asked, "Are you the lady who stood still and didn't let the bad man scare you?" She smiled gently. "Something like that. Still, for all the support, she couldn't sleep through the night. Not yet." Some evenings, she sat on her porch with Simone, talking about everything but the incident. The smell of cut grass, the sound of cicadas, the hum of traffic in the distance. It helped. But healing was slow, and Marlene knew the hardest part hadn't even begun. Because public interest fades, hashtags disappear. But the laws, the culture inside the walls of power, that's what stays if no one pushes back. But she wasn't done pushing, and neither was the truth. A month later, the Internal Affairs report was released. It was blunt. Officer Clint Radford had violated multiple departmental protocols, including failure to follow identification procedures, improper escalation, and use of language deemed indicative of personal bias. The department had no choice. Radford was officially terminated. But what caught most people off guard wasn't his firing, it was the legal motion that followed. The city's Civilian Review Board recommended that the district attorney open an investigation into whether Radford's actions had violated Marlene's civil rights under state and federal law. For the first time in decades, a former officer from the Macon Police Department faced the possibility of prosecution. The courtroom wasn't unfamiliar to Marlene, but now she was sitting on the other side. Not on the bench, not even as a plaintiff, just present, watching. She attended the hearings quietly, seated in the second row with Simone at her side. The judge presiding over the case, a longtime colleague named Helen Moss, acknowledged her only once, with a nod of respect that said more than words could. During the hearing, Radford sat at the defense table, flanked by 2 lawyers. He looked smaller than before, not physically, just reduced. No badge, no weight behind his words. Just another man caught in a storm of his own making. His defense team argued that he acted within the bounds of professional judgment and claimed that Marlene had used her status to manipulate the situation. The courtroom stayed silent, except for the sound of Simone's pen scribbling notes. Then came Officer Medina's testimony. She didn't waver. She described Radford's tone, his language, his refusal to de-escalate. She repeated what he'd said about Marlene pretending to be a victim and you people, without hesitation. When she finished, the room felt heavier. Later that evening, Marlene sat alone in her study, the day's events playing over in her mind. She wasn't interested in revenge. She never had been. What mattered now was setting a precedent. The city had to see that rank didn't justify abuse, that a badge didn't erase responsibility, that what happened on that roadside wasn't just about her, it was about every person who didn't have credentials, cameras, or neighbors watching. A few weeks later, the DA announced they were moving forward with misdemeanor charges, official misconduct, and civil rights violation. It wasn't a felony. It wouldn't mean jail time, but it would go on the record. Forever. The legal community paid attention. Panels were formed. Policies were rewritten. The department introduced a new system for real-time tracking of officer complaints, one that couldn't be quietly buried anymore. Still, there were critics. There always are. Some said it wasn't enough. Others said it was too much. A few claimed Marlene had weaponized her status. One cable news anchor referred to her as an activist in robes. She didn't respond. Instead, she returned to work. She stepped back into her courtroom, wearing her robe again, not to draw a line between her and others, but to remind them that justice still belonged there, not just in statements, but in actions. One morning, during a quiet break between cases, a young clerk brought her a note. It was from Officer Medina. It read, "Thank you for standing tall. You made it easier for me to speak the truth." Marlene folded the note slowly. Her hands, steady as ever, placed it inside the drawer of her desk. Not for safekeeping, but because it mattered. But for every one voice that speaks up, someone else finds the courage to follow. And that's how change begins to hold its ground. 3 months had passed. The headlines were quieter now. The camera crews had moved on to the next outrage, the next scandal, the next moment that made the world pause for just long enough to feel something before turning the page again. But inside Macon's Community Civic Hall, the rows were full. An annual event, small, usually uneventful, had drawn a crowd that tripled last year's numbers. It wasn't just because Judge Marlene DuPont was scheduled to speak. It was because of what she represented now. Not just justice, not just authority, but endurance. When she stepped on stage, the applause came in waves. She stood at the podium with her usual calm. No note cards, no teleprompter. Just her, speaking from a place somewhere deeper than anger. "I've thought a lot about silence these past few months," she began, "and how it protects the wrong people." The room was still. "I spent decades thinking that if I did everything right, if I worked hard, stayed calm, followed the law, respected the badge, I'd be safe. That's what we're taught, right? That the system may be slow, but it works. That character will shield you." She looked out across the room, letting the words settle. But that night on the side of Highway 23, none of that mattered. Not my robe, not my record, not my years of service. To one man with a badge and a bias, I was just inconvenient. So he tried to reduce me to silence, to obedience, to fear. She paused, her voice unwavering. Had I raised my voice, I could have been labeled aggressive. Had I stayed in my car, I could have been called non-compliant. Had I reached for my credentials the wrong way, I might not be standing here now. A quiet murmur swept through the room. But I am standing here, and I'm not here to be applauded. I'm here to tell you something you already know deep down. Justice doesn't live in the courtroom. It lives in what we tolerate outside of it. She stepped away from the mic for a moment. Let the silence carry the weight. Then she said, "We don't need more outrage. We need more courage. The courage to report, to intervene, to speak when silence feels safer." People in the crowd nodded slowly. A few wiped their eyes. Officer Medina didn't raise her voice, but her truth moved mountains. My neighbor didn't stop the arrest, but his video made the lie impossible to defend. Change isn't always loud. Sometimes it just refuses to sit down a beat. And that's what I'll keep doing. In my courtroom, in my community. And in moments when no one is looking, because that's where the real story begins. She stepped back from the podium. No grand gestures, just a slow walk off the stage, while the crowd rose to their feet. Outside, a group of high school students waited to talk to her. One girl, maybe 16, asked softly, "Judge Dupont, how do you stay calm when it feels like no one sees you?" Marlene crouched slightly so they were eye to eye. "They don't have to see you to feel you. Every time you tell the truth, even if your voice shakes, you leave a mark. Don't ever forget that." That moment, like so many others lately, wasn't caught on camera. But it mattered. And that's how Marlene lived now. Not for the noise, but for the after. The part when the cameras go home and the work begins. She wasn't trying to be a symbol. She was just trying to hold the door open a little longer. For the next woman, the next girl, the next voice that wouldn't be ignored. If this story moved you, remember this. Silence protects no one. Speak when it matters. Share this story. Subscribe to the channel, and let's keep these conversations alive, because the world doesn't change by accident.